I'm Mark Halperin, and welcome to Wide World of News. We're talking to a group today of New Yorkers from New York State around the Empire State about how the political leadership of the state has handled this pandemic. And our focus today is going to be on the governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo. His popularity rose so high in the early days as he dealt with leading the state that he was, by some measures, the most popular politician in America. He gave daily briefings that were widely watched, and people lauded his judgment, particularly as compared to the President of the United States, and in some cases, the mayor of New York City. Our group today are largely Democrats, one independent, and folks who plan to vote for Joe Biden largely in this election. And we're going to begin by asking you all to raise your hand if before this pandemic, you had a positive, generally positive view of Governor Cuomo before the pandemic. Raise your hand if you had a generally positive view of the governor. Okay, all of you did. I want to talk a little bit about those briefings that occurred early on when the governor came out every day at the start of this. I'm assuming most of you either watched them or heard about them. Jude, let me start with you. What words would you use to describe the way Governor Cuomo handled himself in those briefings? One or two words?
Lots of strength and organization. And I don't think I missed many. And I was so pleased with, not only did he know what to say, but he followed it up in writing and posted it right there for you to read afterward.
Okay, Denasia, what one or two words would you use to describe the briefings?
I agree with Jude. I think that they were very organized and that Governor Cuomo really laid out a roadmap for the coronavirus pandemic.
Okay, Don, one or two words, if you can, to describe the way he handled himself in the briefings.
Very strong initially. I think a real desire to show the sanctity of life and how that was a real pivotal element to what he was trying to do.
Okay. Tiffany, how about you? One or two words, if you can.
I think he was very reassuring, and it made me feel like someone was behind the wheel when the rest of the world, the rest of the United States didn't really seem like it had any kind of a leader.
Okay, Rooksy, what about you? One or two words.
As Jude and Denisha spoke about his organization, I feel that his approach is pragmatic. The organization illustrates his pragmatism, so pragmatic and strategic.
Okay, Nayala?
I would say controlled and competent for his briefings.
Okay, and Joseph?
And I would say it was incredibly calm and informative. Like at the same time, he wasn't alarmist like a lot of the other outlets were. And he treated the pandemic as if he was talking to his family. I mean, I watched it with my family, and by the end of the pandemic, he became like a household figure.
I want to ask you, I'll throw this open to the group. Whoever has an answer, please speak up. Name something specific the governor did that slowed the spread of the virus in New York State.
Basically closed it down.
Yeah, shutting it down.
Right. And urging masks right from the start.
Okay, do people think he shut it down too soon, too late, or right at the right time?
Too late.
Too late.
Raise your hand if you think he shut down New York too late.
There
Raise
was
your
one...
hand if you think he shut it down too late. Please raise your hand.
Well.
Okay, so all of you raise your hand but Denisha, right? So
Yeah.
let me go back and say, when I asked you what he'd done to help slow the spread of the virus, at least one of you said he shut the state down, but you all think he shut down the state too late. So my sense is that that's not an answer that you'd stand by. So I ask again, anyone can answer. Name a decision he made that helped slow the spread of the virus in the state.
Well, I think really with the way he treated the primary elections and widening absentee ballot access for people and making that really accessible, I think all eligible New York voters got the absentee ballot application in the mail. And I mean, even though in some districts it was kind of a disaster, it did, you had more people voting with the absentee ballot than in person. I think that was really incredible and impressive.
Back to the start, Mark, when we didn't know what was going on and it was so early and there was so much danger, he told the truth every day.
Did that help slow the spread of the virus?
I think it did.
Yeah, I think it did too, because I think that we started to take it more seriously than when you were watching the news or listening to Twitter or the president's. He made it sound like this was all going to go away, and Cuomo made it sound very much like this was happening. We needed to do something about it, and we all needed to mobilize.
Early on, one of the things the governor said was, in many ways, the fear is more dangerous than the virus. Is that something you agree with or you think was wise for him to say?
I disagree that fear is more more a precursor for the virus, triggering the virus, because I think that the contagion, the scientific aspects of the virus, as has come out through research, through contagious effects, was far more dangerous, and which was realized later when he advocated for mandated masks to stop the spread of the virus. So I disagree with him with that particular comment.
Right.
How could you not be afraid? I mean, why wouldn't we be fearful?
Do you think it's accurate that the fear is more dangerous than the virus?
I just think it's a reality.
I actually, I mean, I think the fear is more dangerous than the virus if that fear ends up inflaming like sentiment where it's people are kind of anti-immigrant. Like I think it was a response to how Trump was using the virus as a way to push kind of bigoted agendas on people. And so yes, in that sense, absolutely. But no, I don't think kind of the panic about the virus was more dangerous than the virus itself.
Okay. Raise your hand if you think that in general the governor did a good job or a very good job in dealing with the pandemic. Raise your hand. Okay, so all of you but Don think that. Go back to the question I was asking before. Jude cited, and I think some people seconded the notion of early giving people a sense of urgency. And somebody, Joseph, talked about the elections and the ballots. Can anybody name anything else that you associate with that he did a good job?
Also early on in the pandemic when he waived, he required all New York insurance companies to waive the cost for testing, urgent care, and emergency room visits. And I think that just widened up we were able to get so much more accurate information because people weren't afraid of already further digging themselves in a financial hole by getting tested or doing all this stuff. So it really created such a clear picture that he was able to use to create such a perfect response.
And he put a team in front of us every day. So you felt like there were people gathering data as he spoke. And if he didn't have an answer, he turned to one of them.
Yeah, I agree.
It was good coverage. It really was a daily update.
We talked about some people believing the governor issued the stay-at-home order too late, that he was downplaying the danger early on. There are people who say he closed down the schools too late, well after some people had argued for it. Do people think he closed down the schools too late? He should have done it sooner? Raise your hand if you think he should have closed the schools down sooner.
I just don't know how I could have done anything differently. It was so soon and so early.
What have you all heard, if anything, about the way the state handled the threat early on of there being a community spread in New York state prisons? Have you all heard about that?
Yes.
That came late. I think that was late news.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, early on, a fair amount of the community spread occurred in the prisons, and advocates on behalf of prisoners say Governor Cuomo's administration didn't do enough early on. Is that something you have an opinion about? Is that something that's a fair criticism of him?
I think it's a fair criticism, and I think it also goes in line with criticizing him for the spread within nursing homes. And I think he was really targeting, the individual who has an apartment, who has a family, and was kind of not thinking about these different types of accommodations. And it did end up disproportionately affecting them. So I think, yes, that was a huge flaw, because I feel like at the end of the day, he does know the demographic who will be responsible for his future career.
I want to ask you about the allocation of resources in the medical side. There are a number of hospitals built. The Javits Center in Manhattan was turned into a hospital. I'm wondering if you all have opinions. Now I'll start with you about whether Governor Cuomo's administration did a good job of allocating and asking for and then using medical facilities during the pandemic.
I think that, Cuomo and the rest of, state leadership did the best they could to make policy decisions based off of limited information on a virus that no one really knew the evolving scope and the impact. But I think that, with what Governor Cuomo did do, again, committing the Javits Center and the ship that was dedicated specifically for COVID patients, trying to allocate resources by building coalitions with other governors and states to try and stockpile resources. Again, I think it's a lot clearer or easier, I should say, I think, to pass judgment now that we've kind of gone through, I think, the hardest part of where we were specifically in April. But I think given the circumstances, given the information, and given the looming pandemic that caught New York under-resourced, that Cuomo did the best that he could using his resources and using his team to try to make sure that New Yorkers were taken care of and we had the resources that were available.
And it created that coalition between the states.
What did that coalition achieve, Jude?
Heard from governors other than Cuomo, who at the time were equally strong. And that was great because for a while it looked like he was going to kind of take over the country because no one else would. And then suddenly we had some very strong voices.
But how did those strong voices united contribute to limiting the spread of the pandemic?
Well, the graphs that were shown every day illustrating the number of people who were sick and dying come to uniform. So it looked like the coalition benefited each of those areas.
I want to move to the question of the relationship between the governor and the mayor of New York City, Bill de Blasio. They had, before the pandemic, a relatively contentious relationship. Many people have cited their relationship as being problematic in terms of a unified front within New York. So, Joseph, I'll start with you. Do you see a problem in the tension between the two of them, and who would you put the blame on if you do?
I think Bill de Blasio is the single biggest embarrassment that this state has. I think, early in the pandemic when he was going to get his last pump in at the gym, I think his mind just been completely on amplifying his own voice, whether it's running for president or, challenging Cuomo. I don't think he really cares at all about the city. And I think it's all him trying to make attention for himself. I think, he hasn't had nearly the same clarity that Cuomo has.
So whether you live in New York City or not, raise your hand if you think Bill de Blasio has done a bad job in dealing with the pandemic. Raise your hand if you think he's done a bad job.
I'm not going to say, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm going to stay out of it. I don't know.
I feel the same.
Okay. I want to move to the governor's relationship to the president and their interactions. He's met with the president. They've had a lot of discussions. I'm wondering what you think, how would you rate the performance of Governor Cuomo in navigating the relationship between New York and Washington, specifically the relationship with the president? Tiffany, why don't you go first?
I think he did a good job navigating it. When someone is not talking about facts or science or just gut feelings and what he thinks instead of what his advisors tell you, I don't know how you deal with that when you're actually in the middle of an emergency. So the fact that he was civil in any way, shape, or form was amazing.
Trump is such an obvious target, especially for a state as Democrat as New York. Cuomo is very pragmatic at understanding that there's opportunity for federal aid and federal support. And I think that the way that he managed his relationship with Trump, I think just kind of reflected his understanding of like the financial need and landscape of how federal government and state government need to work together whenever possible.
And he was able to get the comfort here. He was able to get the federal aid. And I remember there was very early on when we had the shortage of ventilators, I don't know, he kind of went on his daily briefing and said, President Trump, you pick the 24,000 people that are going to die because we don't have a ventilator. At the same time, like he knew what New Yorkers needed and he wasn't gonna compromise.
Yeah, I think somebody said it.
I want to move to a topic that's gotten a lot of attention regarding the governor's performance. And Dinesh, I want to start with you. Tell me the story as you understand it, as you've heard it, about what happened with the number of tragic deaths in nursing homes in New York and what happened there with the governor.
Mm-hmm. Governor Cuomo has done everything that he could to assist New Yorkers during this time. And as for nursing homes, I think that Governor Cuomo has definitely taken the steps that he needed to in order to make sure that everybody was taken care of under the entire scope of New York. It's very unfortunate, the rate of the deaths that have happened, but in my opinion, I definitely do think that he has come through for New York during this time.
Is anyone aware of the baseline criticism that the governor's gotten regarding nursing homes? Is anyone aware of that story?
Yes. Yes. I think it came a little bit later in that we were early.
Just describe, if you're talking to someone from outside New York who hadn't heard about it, just describe briefly what the accusations are against the governor's administration regarding nursing homes.
probably that the information was coming in very soon with the death rate being very high. And it was hard to sort of single out why it was happening there more than everywhere else, especially when you had the hospital in Queens and Lenox Hill and all this, and the refrigerator trucks all happening at the same time. It was hard to isolate the fact that the death rate was so high at nursing homes during those early stages.
One of the criticisms was because Cuomo gave the green light, folks who were testing positive for COVID to be admitted into nursing homes, which is the very demographic that, was disproportionately hitting. I think it was roughly like almost 5,000 people in nursing homes lost their lives due to that policy decision.
What do you think of that decision? Was that an honest mistake? Was that careless?
I think it's a mistake that the governor recognized, because he ended up reversing the policy decision. Some might argue too late, but I think that sometimes people in government look at things through a logistical lens and not necessarily through a lived personal experience impact lens, because you have nursing homes which have the beds that at the time New York so desperately needed. And I also think from my understanding that the order came so quickly, and the nursing homes had 24 hours to figure out their staffing, to figure out their logistics. And it just wasn't enough time to be able to separate beds, to separate staff. And the consequences of that lack of preparation, people unfortunately in the nursing homes, lost their lives. So I
very good job of summarizing what the complaint or concern that people have raised about the governor, that he ordered people to go from hospitals back into nursing homes who were infected with the virus, and large numbers of people died. It's been investigated a little bit. I'm wondering if you show of hands again, raise your hand if, having heard that accusation either previously or tonight here for the first time, raise your hand if that error, if you think it's an error, is something that troubles you regarding the governor's performance. Raise your hand if that troubles you.
No. And it doesn't trouble me because, call correctly, the order was to send people back to nursing homes without testing them. But this was back in the end of March when we already had barely any testing to begin with. So we couldn't even test people that, were in the ICU that could barely breathe. How can we test every other person going back to their place of residence? And he did. So no, I think it's more so just a complication, maybe, an oversight, but that was the situation that we found ourselves in March, the end of March.
You all don't seem to have concerns about this. There are people in both political parties in the state legislature in Washington who do have concerns about what the governor did. It has been investigated by a part of the state government. There are those who are calling for a more independent investigation of the circumstances surrounding the governor's decision. I want to play you some sound from the governor from Monday, where he was asked if he would authorize or support another more independent investigation of the decision that was made regarding nursing.
Yeah, first of all, no, I wouldn't do an investigation as to whether or not it's political. Everybody can make that decision for themselves. I think you'd have to be blind to realize it's not political. Just look at where it comes from and look at the sources and look at their political affiliation and look at who wrote the letter in Congress and look at what publications raise it and what media networks raise it. It's kind of incredible. Look at the basic facts on where New York is versus other states, right?
So, Roxy, let me ask you first, does his response there sound to you to be matter of fact, or does it sound defensive? What's your sense of his posture towards these bipartisan calls to have a more thorough investigation?
I think he is more practically speaking, as you referred, matter of fact, because there's this expression, hindsight is 20/20. We can look back and conceive of what should have been done, but in the moment, he was in charge of an entire state, and nursing homes are they are just one aspect of the state. So he had to be aware of the evolving and changing situation in the moment to address with the information he had at the time to address through stay-at-home orders. So he is looking at it from a practical standpoint that an investigation would be fruitless, given that he could only handle the situation with the knowledge he had at the time.
And what's the fear of the investigation if it's a matter of just trying to find out what transpired? I mean, why are we becoming apologists? We acknowledge that he made a mistake. And let's try to determine why that mistake happened. And even for future reference, to be able to have a point of reference to say, okay, how to do things better in the future. But what's the great fear of an investigation?
Maybe it's not a fear, but again, a practical solution. Maybe it's not necessary. Maybe we can learn that without an investigation.
Besides Don, does anybody favor, again, I know you're probably not immersed in the details, but the governor's against an investigation apparently and says it's all political. And there are people, including Democrats in Albany and elsewhere, who'd like to see it investigated along with Republicans. Raise your hand if you agree with Don that there's no reason not to have an investigation and try to understand exactly what happened. Raise your hand if you agree with Don about that. Anybody?
If there should be an investigation?
That there should be. Raise your hand if you think there should be.
What's the end game to the investigation?
The reason I would support an investigation, and I think that this may be splitting hairs, but I think that to investigate is to hold government accountable so that we can learn what went wrong and how we can do it better. But I think that to the point that Cuomo made is that the investigation is being basically framed as a gotcha because he's a political target, because there are a lot of people in the Democratic Party who don't support Cuomo, and they're looking for a reason, basically to, say, shame on you for doing this. So I would support an investigation, not to target Cuomo. I would support an investigation so that government can learn how to do its practices and make better policies so that we do better in the future.
I think at the end of the day, any investigation would kind of be a political witch hunt. I mean, we can write a long list of all the amazing accomplishments that he was able to do in response to the pandemic. That to focus on this one thing, it just seems a bit unnecessary.
But if that's the premise, we should never have investigations about anything because we always frame it and saying it's going through the rubrics of a political witch hunt. If something went wrong and the bureaucracy made a mistake and there's something that was done and wasn't executed properly, don't we want to know why and see how we can make those amends in the future and see where things went wrong? But to just dismiss it simply and say, okay, this is a politically driven activity, let's not do it. Again, we can apply that to any kind of situation that goes on in the past, future, at any time.
But I think at the end of all of this, we have to look at everything that happened across the board. We can't just look at Cuomo. We have to look at how this was handled across the entire nation. If this happens again,
and it will.
Yes, and it will. We did not do a good job. This still is not handled.
And it's going on now.
Correct.
Folks, I want to wrap up with a couple questions, and I want to start with Dinesh and go around. You all have a pretty, for the most part, a pretty favorable view of the governor's performance during this. But I'd like you to think about what you would say, given that New York, had many more cases up until recently than any other state. I'd like you to think about what's the one thing you would say you would fault Governor Cuomo for in how he performed since March in dealing with the pandemic. The one thing that you say is one action he made or decision he made that you think led to more cases in New York, if anything. Dinesh, start with you. What's the one thing you would say?
I would say trying to foster a better relationship with President Trump earlier on to get better results earlier.
Okay. Naila?
And I would say engaging in the political rivalry between De Blasio. De Blasio would make a decision and Governor Cuomo would stall for some time and then essentially end up making the same decision. And, a week it was detrimental in terms of the infection rate in New York.
And just to press you on that, given that you feel that way, you still think he's done a good job overall, right?
Yes, overall, I think that he did the best that he could do given the circumstances, but that's not to say that he did make some missteps and mistakes in the process.
Okay, Roxy, what's the thing you would cite that you think the mistake he made that led to more people getting sick?
His delay in impeding in-person contact through which he later did issuing stay-at-home orders. I felt he should have issued those stay-at-home orders much earlier than he did.
Okay, Tiffany, how about you? One decision that he made that you think?
I agree with that. I think that delaying the stay-at-home orders in the office that I work in, when he cut it back from 25% of the staff, 50%, it didn't change anything on how we were doing things, and I think we could have infected a lot of people during that time.
Okay, Don?
Same thing, stay-at-home order, too late.
Okay, Jude?
I think the nursing home issue was a problem, and that when he put the coalition together amongst the various states, that they could have gotten on top of that at that time.
Okay, and Joseph.
I think that he shouldn't have been so against Rhode Island's policy about pulling over drivers with New York license plates, because I think we need to implement something like that right now, like really badly, if we're trying to avoid a second wave. Like we have these quarantine orders, but come on, I mean, he needs to be doing more in terms of finding these people and making sure they're banned.
Last question. I want you to think about January of 2021, and Donald Trump, let's say under this scenario, is no longer going to be president. I'm going to ask you to think about two different people, Joe Biden and Andrew Cuomo, and who you would rather see be president. If you could just pick, up to you, which one takes office and serves as president starting in January. Raise your hand if you prefer to see Joe Biden as compared to Andrew Cuomo be president. Raise your hand. Okay, and raise your hand if you prefer to see Andrew Cuomo instead of Joe Biden. Okay, interesting. Thank you all for making time. We appreciate it, and thank you at home for watching. We'll see you again right here very soon, another episode of Wide World of News.